Welcome everybody. Welcome to First Teachings. My name is Carl Skooglund, and in this class we explore the first teachings of Buddhism's 2,500-year-old tradition. And this morning we'll continue our exploration of the simile of the cook, which is a teaching we find in something called the Sutta, which is in the collection known as the Samyutta Nikaya, and it's 47.8 is the particular teaching. I notice we have a number of newcomers, and just to give you a little bit of a heads up, this is deep water you're going to be jumping into if you're not completely caught up on the foundations of mindfulness sutta, or some of the other basics. But we'll hopefully during some of the question and answer periods there'll be a chance for you to get caught up or get clarifications. So in this sutta, in this teaching that the Buddha lays out in the simile, what's laid out is that on the one hand, there's a cook who serves food with different kinds of flavors, different kinds of tastes. And then that cook clues in to how his patron responds. Right? The cook picks up on the signs that his patron gives him about what particular tastes he is enjoying. And then the cook is thus rewarded. The teaching then goes on to say that in a similar fashion, a Dhamma practitioner who is working with one of the various themes of mindfulness, the various flavors of mindfulness, you might say, well, they clue into the signs that their mind is giving them. They clue into how their mind responds, to the themes that they've offered themselves. And as a result, the practitioner is rewarded. Their heart and mind come into a peaceful abiding. They come into clear awareness, and they come into a kind of freedom from the kilesas, that is attraction, aversion, and confusion. Simply put, the rewards, the fruits of this particular practice are peace, clarity, and freedom. And the key issues of this teaching are first, what to bring to mind, what to offer the mind as a theme of contemplation. And then second, we pick up on the signs of how our hearts and minds respond to what we've offered. One reason that I love this teaching is that it's a straightforward answer to the question, how do I make the fruits of this practice less random and more reliable? And the teaching makes clear that the practice is not about forcing ourselves into just one kind of practice, into one kind of spiritual food, you might say. Instead, the idea is to try out this, try out that, and pick up on the signs that are of what our hearts and minds, come to favor. So if we sit down to practice or in our daily lives and we find that we're not engaging, we find that we're engaging in practice and that it's rewarding, then great, keep doing it. But if we find that our hearts and minds are just not into it, well, then there are some adjustments that we can make. According to the simile, the themes, the food that we offer the mind are the four broad themes of mindfulness, as laid out in the Satipatthana Sutta. That is the body, feelings of pleasure and pain. The third is chitta, or mind. And then the fourth is dhammas, which is just a variety of Dhamma teachings. Now, the sutta does not say exactly what the signs are that we're supposed to pick up on. So in one of the prior classes, I took the liberty of framing that question in terms of the facets of mindfulness that we find at the very beginning of the Foundations of Mindfulness Sutta. And approaching it that way, the signs that our minds can give us included, first, are we able to abide contemplating? And next, are we ardent, aware, and mindful? And then finally, are we able to set aside attraction and distress with regard to the world? I'd like to say a little something about each of these signs before we dive into the main content of the class, which will be the 5 hindrances. So first, the first important sign that our mind could give us is that we're not able to, or that we are not able to abide contemplating. Let's say we've brought to mind the theme of breathing, but the mind doesn't settle in. We're not into it. That first important sign could mean a number of other things. It could be a sign that we need to nurture our ardency. And ardency, not so much in the sense of, trying real hard. Instead, ardency more in the sense of, whether we're valuing in that moment what the practice can do for us. And that the value systems of the Dhamma are not in conflict with other value systems that our minds might create. Value systems that might lead us into wandering and distraction. So ardency can take the form of reminding ourselves why we're practicing. Reminding ourselves what good things we were wanting to have happen, for ourselves and those around us. And it's in this way that ardency is an expression of metta. It's an expression of goodwill. It was not uncommon for the Buddha to give people what today we would call a pep talk. So ardency can take the form of us giving our own selves, a good pep talk, get us enthused. The next facet, for the next sign, if we're not settling in, if we're getting caught in little worlds created by thoughts and emotions, it might be a sign that we need to nurture what's called sampajanya, nurture clear comprehension, as it's sometimes translated. We can help ourselves with this by engaging in what's commonly called noting practice, right? In which we apply short, internal, verbal words or phrases to whatever is happening. And this practice is great for helping us wake up out of identification with thoughts and emotions, and regain a measure of peace and balance. Next, if we're not settling in, it could be a sign that our mindfulness has become random. That is, jumping from thing to thing, instead of becoming established within a theme. And this notion of becoming established, it is how mindfulness is portrayed in Buddhism's first teachings. We really get settled in with one theme. But another thing, and this is no small thing, is that we just may need to serve ourselves up a different theme, right? Serve ourselves up a different kind of Dhamma food. Try something besides the breathing, right? And this is perhaps the key point of the sutta, the simile of the cook, right? Try something different. See how we respond. Next, if we're not settling in, if we're getting distracted and drawn off, it could be a sign that we have not yet set aside longing and distress with regard to the world. This is a tricky one. right? But just to say that in the Buddha's way of thinking, that when we engage in periods of practice, we help the world by helping ourselves. It's not a one or the other. It's not a zero-sum game, right? We help the world by helping ourselves. So if our experience is floundering, though, it could mean a sign that we don't trust that yet. So that can be a good thing to reflect on if we are encountering that in our practice. So those are the signs, our minds could be giving us, ways in which our minds might respond to the various themes of mindfulness. I'd like to offer one more set of comments about mindfulness itself. In Thanissaro Bhikkhu's book, Right Mindfulness, Thanissaro Bhikkhu is an American monk trained in the Thai forest tradition. He wrote this book called Right Mindfulness, and in one part of it, he talks about how an early translator of the Pali Canon in the late 1800s, the fellow's name was T.W. Rice David. He was trying to find an English word for the Pali word sati. And he cued off of an Anglican prayer from the time, part of which said, make us ever mindful of the needs of others. Now, what Rice David did was make up the noun mindfulness, based on the adjective mindful. And apparently, in Old English, the word mindful meant good memory. Just as sati, in its original Pali meaning, meant memory. Okay, so the intention reflected in the prayer is that we remember, we recall the needs of others. Well, what does that mean for our understanding of mindfulness? Well, mindfulness often gets translated as awareness, but to even be aware of something, we have to bring it to mind in the first place. So awareness is awareness, and bringing something to mind, that's mindfulness. That is the difference, that Thanissaro Bhikkhu would have us understand about how the Pali Canon portrayed and understood mindfulness. One of the other things about mindfulness, as it's portrayed in the early teachings, is that it's proactive. That is, we're proactive about what we bring to mind. And this is the point of view that the Sutta Sutta, the simile of the cook, makes clear, that we're to proactively bring to mind themes, flavors that our hearts and minds will respond favorably to. It's the reason for this teaching, is that we're to be proactive. In the last class, we completed our contemplation of the third Satipatthana, the third foundation of mindfulness, which is chitta, or mind. So this morning, we'll begin our exploration of the fourth foundation, the fourth Satipatthana, which is a collection of teachings found elsewhere in the canon, collectively referred to as the Dhammas, sometimes translated as mental qualities or mental phenomena. But this set of teachings includes first the hindrances, which is what we'll be getting into this morning. Second is the aggregates, the six senses, the factors of awakening, and then finally the Four Noble Truths. So don't try to keep all that in your head, but if you already know it, great, but don't try to memorize that on the spot. This morning, like I said, I'd like to focus on the first of those, the hindrances. But before we dive in, I would like to check and see if I've lost anybody. Are there any questions or comments at this point? Yes, Emily.
So just to be clear, you were talking about Rice David and the definition for sati and mindfulness. And mindfulness is awareness of being mindful. Is that?
Mindfulness has often come to be translated as awareness.
Yes.
But it actually, originally, it meant memory. So in the early texts, we have this phrase, sati sampajanya. Sati refers to the mindfulness part, the memory part. It's what we bring to mind. And sampajanya is more the awareness part. The two work together. So you bring something to mind, that's sati, and then we become clearly aware of it. We clearly comprehend it. That's the sampajanya part. And the two often are put together into actually what looks like one word, but they're two different aspects.
Yeah, it's a long word. So I'm not holding on to the memory. Okay. I'll look it up. Thanks.
And Carl,
yes, Valerie.
I thought it was really interesting when you said if like you're wanting to focus on themes that the heart and mind respond to, and if the breathing is not working for you, maybe think about trying something else. And I was just wondering what that might be. Like, is that like walking meditation? Is that like focusing on like the breathing in a different part of the body? Is it focusing on body awareness? Like,
yeah, it's really any one of the other. The breathing is the theme that the Buddha starts us out with in the Satipatthana Sutta. But then he goes on, there are five other parts related to the body. There's feelings of pleasure and pain. There are different mind states. And then we get into these Dhamma teachings. All of those are the other things that we could take up as a theme for contemplation, anupassana. Right? So there's a lot. There's too much food to eat in one sitting, but those are the options we have available to us. Okay? Anybody else? Okay. Just to start, I'm going to just quickly paraphrase Thanissaro Bhikkhu's translation of this part of the Satipatthana Sutta. And I'm going to read the part on sense desire, but it's the same for the other hindrances, which I'll get into. Yeah, so here we go. So I'm reading from again, Thanissaro Bhikkhu's translation. He translates here. He says, there is a case where a monk remains focused on mental qualities. These are that's broadly speaking, the fourth foundation. Focused on mental qualities in and of themselves with reference to the five hindrances. And how does a monk remain focused on mental qualities with reference to the five hindrances? There is the case where, there being sense desire present within, a monk discerns, there is sense desire present within me. Or, there being no sense desire present within, he discerns there is no sense desire present. Or third, he discerns how there is the arising of sense desire, or he discerns how there is the abandoning of sense desire, or finally, he discerns how there is the no further appearance of sense desire. And there are four other hindrances, which are ill will, sloth and drowsiness, restlessness and anxiety, and uncertainty. So there are the 5 hindrances. And then there are these 5 these 5 discernments that go along with each. Now, in the early tradition, the hindrances are portrayed as being those actions of mind that hinder concentration. They hinder what are called the jhanas. Now, in another section, in another sutta, in Anguttara Nikaya 551, the Buddhist teaches that the hindrances, they overwhelm the mind and they weaken wisdom. He says, just as if a great river, deep and wide, would lose its force if people divert it in different directions. Now, I love this image of the mind being a great river. You know, it portrays to me how the mind has the potential to be collected, directed, unified, powerful yet peaceful. But the image also portrays how the river is vulnerable to being diverted and weakened. You know, just like the energy of our own mind can be weakened by ways of distraction, by way of diversion. In another teaching, in Majjhima Nikaya 43:20, verse 20, it said that the abandonment of the 5 hindrances leads to jhana, which is portrayed as sustained reflection. It also includes pleasure and unification of mind. Just to say, the jhanas were an incredibly important part of the path, you know, and the idea being that the deep clarity and calmness of jhana, they lead to clear seeing. And what we see are the subtlest disturbances of the mind, the subtlest concoctions, the subtlest fabrications, and then leaving behind layer after layer of disturbance, it opens up layer after layer of freedom. And this deep peace and clarity, you know, that we can open into, they are something that we are encouraged to bring about within us, you know, to deepen and make reliable. It's not something that, you know, we might just happen to encounter and then look upon with detachment, you know, letting it go wobbly and pass away because it's impermanent. That wasn't the idea early on. You know, but here's the deal. Even if we as lay practitioners, you know, even if our lives aren't ideally set up to come into jhana, the 5 hindrances are still a really helpful framework to name what, unfortunately, might very often characterize our mental environment. You know, they provide a really basic, really helpful vocabulary for naming large swaths of our inner experience. Again, we may not get into jhana, but with this part of the practice, it can get us in the very good habit of working our way out of the major and the minor head trips that we can create within ourselves. One manifestation, or this is one manifestation of freedom from clinging, from freedom of identification, freedom from identification that's pointed out in the refrain of the Satipatthana Sutta. It can be a huge relief. And one way I've thought about it over the years is that it's like we learn to interact. It's like when we learn how to interact with the hindrances. It's like similar to learning how to interact with waves crashing on the beach. You know, we learn how not to get harmed, how not to get slammed, you know, not getting driven into the sand. Ironically, we do this by learning to dive into the waves. But, we come out the other side unharmed. And in this simile, you might think of swimming out beyond where the waves are crashing, as coming into jhana. So there's sort of the two stages there. Anyway, coincidentally, I think this is an appropriate theme for our Independence Day festivities, or our Independence Day weekend, But rather than becoming independent externally, which is kind of what the holiday is about, instead of relying on the kinds of liberty that the outside world decides to grant or to take away, the Buddha would have us to become independent internally. That's where these teachings take us. So that's the setup. We've got the hindrances and 5 inquiries for each. The hindrances are desire, ill will, torpor, restlessness, and doubt. And then we're to make ourselves clear, whether the hindrance is present or whether it's not, how it arises, how it is abandoned, and how it is prevented. So let me say a little more about what the hindrances are. So simply put, the hindrances, again, are mental qualities, mental energies, mental activities, actions that the heart and the mind engage in that, again, hinder peace and composure. They hinder understanding. The first hindrance is sense desire. And what this basically is the gravitational attraction that we feel in regard to not pleasure of the path, but the more mundane material type of pleasure. That's what this first hindrance points to. We want these material pleasures to come, and we want them to stay. The second hindrance is aversion, or ill will, or it's also referred to as anger. And these energies are also a kind of wanting, but it's wanting something to go away or to stay away. And then there's sloth and torpor, this being physically or mentally lethargic. Sloth would rather just not bother with practice, and torpor is an unhelpful lack of energy. Next is restlessness or anxiety, and again, this is either physical or mental. In either case, it's being amped up. It's excessive energy. And the fifth is doubt. The fifth hindrance is doubt, and I think doubt may be the most interesting because it can sometimes hide itself. For example, one part of your mind, might see the value in settling the attention in the present moment, but maybe another part of the mind doesn't trust that that's a good use of your time and energy. That you should be doing something else, that you should be thinking about something else. Doubt is what makes you want to get up off of the cushion. Doubt is also that voice that says, I'm not good at this, or this isn't working. Right? That being said, questioning is excellent. Questioning is very helpful. Teaching the testings to see what works best at certain times is excellent, but doubt is an undercutting, impatient mistrust. It's a form of mistrust. So I'd like to offer some more thoughts about this in a moment. But I'd first like to give us a chance to sit for a short while, collect ourselves a little bit before I toss a whole lot more ideas your way. So as usual, you might find it helpful to adjust your posture. Come into a posture that's stable yet upright. Let your eyes close if you like. You might find it helpful to breathe in and feel your body. Breathe out and relax. Breathe in and feel your body. Breathe out and relax. And now I invite you to check out the current energetic qualities of your heart, your mind, your body. Let's check out these qualities in terms of how they might align or relate to the hindrances. So to start, notice any energetic quality of leaning forward, any energetic quality of being attracted. Just notice if that's there. Or just as important, notice if that kind of energy is not there. Notice if you're free of it or relatively free of it right now. And next, you might notice the energetic quality of aversion. Notice if it's there. Notice the energy of the heart or the mind leaning away or pushing away. And again, just as important, notice if you're relatively free of aversion right now. Feel what it feels like to not be entangled in aversion. Third, notice if there's any quality of excessive energy, of unhelpful energy, of restlessness. which might also feel like anxiety or worry. Notice if that's there. But if that is not there, notice that. Notice that you're free of restlessness. Feel the feeling of being free of it. And fourth, notice if you're experiencing any sense of diminished energy. Notice if there's the energy of sleepiness, of tiredness, or maybe it's the energy of not being interested, of not wanting to bother with things right now. Or notice now if you're relatively free of that, free of sleepiness. Notice if your energy is up. And finally, notice the energy of being doubtful, being skeptical. This could show up as the mind wandering, wanting to do something else. Or maybe it's an energy of feeling confused or foggy, unclear. Or notice if you're relatively free of doubt. Notice if you're trusting the practice in these moments. You know for yourself the value of it. See if that's true for you right now. And then just broadly, whatever hindrance related energies you might be experiencing for now, just be clear about it. Or you may notice a relative freedom from those energies, these activities of mind. In that case, notice, be clear for yourself, the energy of the mind being settled, collected, composed. Notice the happiness that might be here because the heart and the mind are peaceful. Notice that sign the heart and mind might be giving you. So I hope that was helpful. So those were the hindrances themselves, but the way I'd like to spend the rest of our time is to explore the discernments, explore the inquiries that were woven into the teaching. In particular, whether hindrance is present or not, how it comes about, how we let go of it, and how it's kept at bay. So we can serve these inquiries up to ourselves as themes of mindfulness, as themes of contemplation, and see how our minds respond in the spirit of the simile. So the first inquiry that goes along with each of the 5 is to know if a hindrance is present. It can be interesting, as a method of practice to methodically go down the list, similar to a body scan, which you might be familiar of, and ask, am I being impacted by desire, aversion, sloth, worry, or doubt? It's basically what we just did in this meditation. It can sometimes be a great help to simply be clear, take note about what's giving you a hard time, what's hindering you in a broad brush way. This is a form of sampajanya, clear comprehension, like I just said. It can be that moment when we note, oh, right, this is craving. That's what's going on. And then we can wake up out of it, be free of it. But it can also be worthwhile to inquire at a more micro level. And here I'm going to get a little detail oriented. So hang in there with me, I hope. We can figure out, what each of the hindrances is actually made of. What goes into labeling an experience as one hindrance, one kind of hindrance rather than another. What particular mental and physical sensations ride with each? Do they have discernible locations in mind and body? We are going to explore what are called the 5 aggregates in our next class. And what we can do is define the hindrances in terms of the aggregates. So, for example, we can ask, where and how does the hindrance show up in the body? The body being the first aggregate. Where does aversion show up in the body, in the breathing? This is one example. Or, what particular pleasure is the hindrance trying to get at, or what particular pain is the hindrance trying to avoid? Pleasure and pain are the second aggregate. If I'm restless about something, my mind is racing. What am I worried about? What particular pain am I hoping I get, or what pleasure am I pain am I trying to avoid? The third aggregate is perceptions. So we can ask, what perceptions, what labels might we be applying to a certain set of experiences, that are creating a hindrance? This includes what kind of self-images or points of view that we might be bringing to bear. Might a hindrance be trying to create and project, a positive self-image, or defend and fight against a negative self-image? Thoughts, going on to the next, thoughts, emotions, and intentions are the fourth aggregate. And with this one, we can ask, what particular emotions happen with each kind of hindrance? what particular internal narratives and chatter might go along with each hindrance. What movies or images, the visual stuff, what does the mind kick up? Or fifth and finally, what are we making ourselves conscious of, when we're creating a particular hindrance, consciousness itself being the fifth aggregate. And by the way, these aggregates are in the outline that I sent in the email a couple of days ago, if you're interested in looking that up, referring back to it. So these are examples of how we might deconstruct and investigate, not just the presence of a hindrance, but what it's made of exactly. And viewed from the vantage point of the simile of the cook, this form of mindfulness can be really engaging, really interesting, once we get sort of over the feeling of being overwhelmed by all the technicalities. But once we dive in and kind of get used to it, kind of like how most of us are used to driving a car by now, it can be quite complex if your first time behind the wheel, but there's some of the stuff we just get used to over the time, and it becomes more or less automatic, something we're comfortable doing. Alongside that, ironically, if our sampajanya is really zeroed in, if our awareness is strong and stable, that part of our mind can be really peaceful, even as we're contemplating a disturbance. So just take note of that as a possibility. So again, I want to stop for a moment and see if everybody's keeping up, or if you're totally overwhelmed and want to give up. But whatever the case, if there are questions, please let me know. I'll do my best to answer.
Carl, thank you for the teaching. I'm speaking up because this is my first time, and this is very timely, very helpful to me. Spot on. You're sort of affirming and fleshing out things that I am only just beginning to understand. So thumbs up, very helpful.
Great, okay. Yes, Misha, hey.
Hey, Carl, thanks. Are you going to be addressing today the issue of a multiple hindrance attack?
I wasn't in particular, but I'd love to get into that in the sort of the final question and answer period. Sometimes that in and of itself is something to name. It may not just be the one thing, but it's not one or the other. It could be, as you say, a number of things going on. Maybe we're checking all 5 boxes.
Thanks.
Yeah, there is that possibility as well. And then just in my own experience, sometimes it's good to switch labels, switch perceptions, and label that kind of experience as the First Noble Truth. This is dukkha. This is what the Buddha was talking about by, wow, sometimes it's really hard. And here I am, and this is it. Are there any other questions or comments? Okay, well, moving on then. The second discernment is that we know if a hindrance is not present. So in going down the list, it can be easy to kind of check the box and say, yep, that's not here. But at times it can be really helpful and really rewarding to settle into the fact that the mind is relaxed in a way that it might more often be disturbed. Right? Neuroscience shows us that we have this thing called a negativity bias. And if you're familiar with Buddha's brain, Rick Hanson's book, one of the things he says in there is Velcro, our mind is like Velcro for negative experience and Teflon for positive experience. So especially if you're a type like I am to have, a favorite hindrance, one that tends to really dog you, it can be helpful, it can be satisfying to pause over its absence. Notice its absence and pause. Let that sink in, and let that take up the theme of a whole meditation, perhaps. And note, what thoughts are not obsessing the mind. What uncomfortable bodily sensations are absent. We can look on with gratitude that the mind and the heart are not pestering themselves in ways that they might typically like to pester themselves. And, here's another really interesting and helpful aspect of this. If you stay mindful and alert to the hindrance's absence, if that's what you're contemplating and keeping in mind, it's easy to catch it when it does start to stir. Right? You can notice the subtle shifts in energy, the pre-thoughts, you might call it, that mark the arising of the hindrance. But, even if the anger or the worry does find a gap, if your intention is to stay mindful of its absence, it's more possible for you to catch it immediately, or more quickly than normal, before it has a chance to get a firm footing and gain momentum. Okay, moving on to the third. The third inquiry is how the hindrance arises. Here with this one, we're exploring what you might call conditionality. That is, what causes what brings about what. With this, we clue in to the causes, of whatever hindrance we're experiencing are. With this one, we can engage in what you might think of as a kind of reverse engineering. We can deconstruct the chain of events, the chain of conditions that led to the hindrance arising. For example, in our practice, we might figure out, why is anxiety arising? And personally, I think it's okay. And I think that there's room for interpretation, interpretation of the texts that allow this. It's fine to engage in a little contemplative thinking, as long as it doesn't spin off into identification. What we can ask ourselves, what is the mind trying to achieve as it engages in anxiety? We can ask, what's the draw? What's the allure? What is it after? Or put another way, what problem is the hindrance trying to solve? What does it want to have happen? Our minds and our karma are complex, and it's not uncommon that our wanting, our clinging has multiple layers, but we can dive under all those waves of frantic thinking, the physical unrest, and get to something deeper, get to some understanding. This often takes patience. And it sometimes requires no small amount of honesty, because sometimes it's not flattering, the things that we find ourselves wanting. We might have to confess, our little rationalizations, our little justifications. But overall, the key, I think, is to discover the particular point of clinging or the particular point of misunderstanding, associated with the hindrance. And it's at that point that, we give ourselves a chance for the clamor to subside. There's another important aspect to all of this, something that's described in a section we find in the collection of discourses called the Anguttara Nikaya. In this one particular section, it points out, and I think this is so important, it points out that attraction, aversion, and doubt arise because of what's called a yoniso manasikara, which is often translated as careless attention. So what this means is that we fall into attraction, aversion, and doubt because we give our attention over to something, or we pay attention to something in a particular way, such that it doesn't do us any good, such that it creates a disturbance, creates a hindrance. So if I'm walking down the sidewalk, for example, there are multiple things that I could pick up on and pay attention to in that, common everyday experience. I could look at my phone. I could look at the people around me, the displays in the shops. I could pay attention to the sensations of walking, as we meditators are encouraged to do. There are, many different experiences I could create within this simple act of walking, and they all depend on what I attend to. And of course, another aspect of this is, how there's this relentless knocking on our mental door, people trying to get our attention, in all kinds of ways. People want us to pay attention to them, or to the particular idea that they have, or to the particular thing they want us to have, they think we should have, particular commodity. So in the midst of all this, it seems to me important to remember that in the early teachings, the Buddha pointed out that our attention could be careless. It's possible for our attention to become careless. And instead, he taught careful attention, yoniso manasikara, wise, skillful attention. He taught this because it does matter, in his framework, it does matter what we pay attention to and how we pay attention to it. So one question, to reflect on, that we could reflect on any given moment, is whether we're paying attention to something in a way such that we create attraction, aversion, or confusion. Or are we paying attention in ways that, free us up? Another way to put it is that, could I be looking at something differently, paying attention to something in a certain way, such that I create ease rather than dis-ease. Right. And this, I think, is a good segue into the fourth inquiry, that being, how a hindrance is abandoned, how it's let go of. And as I said before, this isn't about, how a hindrance happens to pass away, because as the Buddhists like to remind us, all things are impermanent. Instead, it's a reflection of right effort. Another part of the Eightfold Path, that is, how we set aside things that don't help us, things that don't help those around us. We actively set those aside. Sometimes a hindrance can simply be set aside by the clear seeing of it, realizing that it's happening, and it's like, it's not necessary to do that. And we can let go. Or maybe we realize that there's nothing particularly profound about what we've attached ourselves to. It's simply a habit we've gotten ourselves into. So we can make the choice to, change the subject, so to speak. Change the channel, turn the page. Another thing that's helped me in my practice is remembering one of the observations of a character from 1980s Saturday Night Live. That character's name was Rosanna Dana. I can see that people of a certain age group are laughing at that, but some others are not quite clued in. But what this character would say at the end of every one of her skits was, "It's always something. It's always something." The meaning of which was that there's always something that's going to be some kind of a problem, right? Well, the Dhamma connection might be that, you might encounter that one part of your mind that isn't happy unless it's got some sort of a problem to figure out. That's just the kind of activity that it likes to engage in. So there do seem to be those parts of the mind that, find some reason to be uneasy. But then another part of the mind can kind of say, enough already, this isn't required. I don't need to do this. So that being said, just as often, abandoning a hindrance might feel more like untangling a big, tight, tightly wound knot of rope. Our clinging, can be deep, it can be habitual, can be, built up over a lifetime. It may be even deeper than that. There are forms of clinging that you might have come to realize are biological in nature. They're evolutionary. It's about basic survival. It can also be about social status. There's a evolutionary people. I'm of the opinion that us wanting to maintain our social status is it's evolutionary in nature. It's impersonal. It's something that's built up over time. So what we might need to do then is, given all of these possibilities, is have multiple approaches. So we can reflect on one thing to do is to reflect on the harm, reflect on the drawbacks of maintaining a particular attachment that's creating a hindrance. We might realize how our clinging is impersonal, right? It's not about my particular life story. This clinging is woven deep within the human condition, and it just happens to be manifesting itself in me, in this moment, in this way right now. We might also share our experiences in the company of friends, sharing difficult experience and feeling the support of friends can help to bring about release, when it's something we might not have been able to do on our own. Another approach is that we can intentionally replace a hurtful desire or habit with a skillful aspiration. We don't have to leave beneficial states of mind to chance. Right? Instead, we can be proactive. We can make skillful, beneficial mind states strong. These mind states and mental qualities that inspire and help us. We can proactively make them strong. But as I said before, sometimes, as Misha mentioned, we get in a multiple hindrance attack. It's not going anywhere. At least not during one particular meditation session. The best we can do is to just rest in clear comprehension. Acknowledge fully that it's there. And as I said, just might help just to be clear. This is what the Buddha was talking about. This is dukkha. This is the first noble truth. And sometimes being clear about that rather than trying to avoid it, that can help the mind come into a certain kind of composure, because we're not adding the running away to the pain itself. We're not creating more problems out of the problems that were already there. One other thing that I think can help us negotiate this terrain, this mental landscape, is to consider the diversity of this mind of ours. I think it's amazing that 2,500 years ago, the Buddha said this, and it's recorded in Samhita Nikaya 22, verse 100. He said, "This mind is more variegated, more diverse than the animal kingdom." You know, just to have that as something that was thought about, you know, and taken on as an observation and then as a spiritual practice, it's amazing to me. And as you probably know, that over the years, people have found different ways of portraying this. You know, there's the image of the devil and the angel, you know, one on each shoulder. You know, the Cherokee have the parable of the two wolves. You know, the one that we feed is the one that gets stronger. Tanisaru Bhikkhu speaks of the minds being a committee, right? Or we say that we have mixed emotions, right? These all point to the kinds of variety and diversity that can happen within ourselves. And in our own practice, we may encounter that part of the mind that wants peace, wisdom, and kindness, but there are other parts that want stimulation, that want something interesting and entertaining to be happening, and we toggle back and forth between the two. So here's where, you know, in order to let go, it may help to clarify those different voices. You know, we can take time in meditation to be clear for ourselves. Why is it that we go for certain things? You know, why is it that we create disturbance rather than peace? You know, we can be honest ourselves about, you know, what's the allure of a particular set of mental actions. You know, what am I being drawn to? You know, part of the mind accepts the disturbance because in some sort of a trade-off, it's getting something out of it. You know, we can be clear about that. The Buddha actually has us be clear about that. I was once having a discussion with a Dhamma friend about renunciation. And at what point she said to me, "Carl, I want to want what I want, because if I don't want it, I won't get it." Right? That's sort of the conundrum. So the fact is, that we relish, we find delight, in some sort of activity, but it can help to be clear about that. So alongside that, we can take time in meditation to wake ourselves up to the drawbacks, of certain ways in which we create disturbance, and reacquaint ourselves with why we wanted to come and engage in this practice. We can take up as a theme of contemplation, what kind of a mind do I really want? How do I want my heart to be? But if we are getting hung up, one question might be to ask, what is my mind valuing? What is my mind making important, when I'm in the midst of some attraction or restlessness? Check this out for yourself and see if it's true. The mind makes what it wants. It creates what it values. And as I've been saying, this diverse mind of ours has a mix of value systems, so that even as one part of this practice wants to engage in the practice, or as we will encounter that as we engage in practice, one part of the mind wants to engage in practice, whereas another part, does not. But we can encourage that aspect of the mind, feed it, that part of the mind that wants something better for itself. So a real turning point in all this is seeing the dukkha, seeing how engaging in the hindrances, it hurts, which might help our minds turn towards something different, come to value the peace and clarity that comes from being released from them. So that's a piece on the fourth inquiry. The fifth and last, we're coming down the home stretch here. It was how a hindrance is prevented, how it's kept at bay. This, to my way of thinking, is, it points to how we don't have to sit back on our heels, waiting for a hindrance to make its appearance. Instead, we can be proactive, about creating positive options for ourselves. As the Buddha said, and as I like to quote, whatever you frequently think and dwell upon, that will be the inclination of your mind. So with that in mind, we can actively reflect on the qualities of mind that we do value, that we do want. Like I said a moment ago, what we can think, what do we want our minds to be like? What things do we want to make an inclination? A habit of mind. What do we want to make strong and reliable within ourselves? And then we can keep that aspiration in mind, in our practice and in our daily activities. And in doing so, we're creating a new set point for ourselves, a new normal, a new kind of mental world, a new kind of reality. We can be proactive in that way. So I want to quickly address some of the common concerns that may arise with these last two inquiries. The idea of abandoning and keeping at bay certain things that come up. It makes me. I was having a conversation once with a Dhamma friend of mine. She happens to be a practicing psychologist, and I was describing these 5 inquiries. I got to the last 2, again, about abandoning and preventing, certain these hindrances, and she very quickly said, that sounds like suppression. That sounds like suppression. And this is a common reaction, for the alarm bells to go off, not just among psychologists, these notions, that we should abandon and prevent certain thoughts and feelings and emotions. It may feel, it can be generally felt that, doing things like that, it's not just unhealthy. What it's doing is that we're denying, we're alienating integral core parts of our human nature, core parts of ourself. I would like to do a deep dive into this subject in our next class, because it's the aggregates that set up the best comparison between the Buddha's way of viewing ourselves and the more contemporary ways. So that's a little bit of a tickler, a little bit of an invitation to show up in August. But to wrap things up, I want to offer a few thoughts on how to work with this teaching, in your practice. So first, in your formal practice, and I guess in your daily activities too, pick your favorite hindrance, identify that hindrance that your mind has a habit of wanting to engage in, and then keep it in mind. Keep it in mind and bring the 5 inquiries to bear. Right? Really drill down and work with it, as a form of contemplation. And alongside that, you might pick a situation in which you normally get triggered. And then be proactive about reflecting on it. Explore what it might take for you to not get triggered. Contemplate that, visualize that. Try to see what brings about disturbances and try to see what helps to calm the disturbances, your typical ones, your favorites. And, give yourself, again, those little pep talks, about wanting composure instead of agitation. Remind yourself, what do I really want my mind to feel like inside? How do I want my heart to feel? In doing these kinds of things, I think it helps to realize that we're developing a skill. A skill that I think is important to point out that's transferable. So we can learn it in one set of circumstances, and we can apply it elsewhere. Once we get good at it. So this little array, I have found it's such rich terrain in practice, and I invite you to play around with it. And, like a cook playing around in the kitchen, I invite you to try new things, see what works. So that is all I wanted to say. We do have a few more minutes to hear from you all. I appreciate your attention. I appreciate your patience. So please, if anybody would like to say anything, please chime in. Thank you.
I just had a quick question about, you mentioned the hindrances and you connected it to evolutionary, them being evolutionary and help us maintain social status.
Mm-hmm.
So can you just clarify that?
Yeah, what I like to what has helped me to contemplate is that these urges to be concerned about praise and blame, in the social realm, there's something that, first of all, there's something that the Buddha liked to talk about a lot. He I think, correctly emphasized them and how much they can show up in this mental environment of ours. So there are something to pay attention to, but they're also something that, in terms of our biology,
Right.
they help us survive.
The hindrances.
The praise and blame, praise and criticism.
Right.
But the hindrances too. There's the basic fear and fear, flight, fight. Feed. All of that. It's not just a personal problem. It's something that's been built up, conditioned within us for a billion years or however long. I can't remember the number, how long we've had life on this earth, but it's been a while.
I just wanted also to mention that it's impossible that we'll always be skillful and maintain balance. And I think the struggle for humanity is, the challenges of dealing with all of these emotions. But all of art is based on the expression of these challenges. So it's not so much finding a solution, but understanding the struggle and being able to express it, because we'll never be completely rid of all of these issues, all of these problems. We have a way, like I understand the skillful way, but it's never going to be perfect. It's never going to, there's always going to be things, right? Like you said, it's always something. But that's what all of art is based on. We wouldn't have art, music, literature, poetry, if we were all very skillful all the time, right? It's just part of the human condition. And it's existential in some way.
Yeah. I think art can express dukkha. It can also inspire, for sure. So
Yes.
I do want to point out that, that what makes this tradition a little remarkable is that it does point out that it's not so much a matter of always being skillful, but it does point out an ultimate off-ramp to all of this stuff that has burdened humanity. There is that possibility of full awakening.
It's like a catharsis, right? Art is a catharsis in some way.
Catharsis. I want to understand a little bit more about
It shows
what that means, but
it shows us how it shows the struggle, and it shows in some way how it can be dealt with. Sometimes there's no resolution. There's no resolution. It's part of the human condition. But I think all of these practices are useful for daily self-management. But if you look at our culture and our world, it's much more complex than that in some way.
Yeah, I don't think it may sound insensitive, but the Buddha was not trying to solve the world as a whole.
Right.
He invited each of us to
Right.
solve the problems we find within these particular fathom-long bodies, as he said.
Yes.
That was his. He kind of picking up on the last class. That's what he would have us focus on, the things that we can actually do something about.
So I also want to thank you very much for the teaching today. Thank you, Carl.
So, Carl, I just love the image that you had of diving into the waves to get to the other side.
Mm-hmm.
That was such, in terms of the 5 hindrances, I can tick them off at times, but when it comes down to it, and discerning them, I think is useful for me, although they overlap. But that your message to focus on the positive, to think through the questions that you presented about, are they present? How do you deal with it? How do you keep them at bay? That's all such great insight for me today. Thank you.
That's great.